Peter was the person who told me this really pithy quote. In a world that's changing so quickly, the biggest risk you can take is not taking any risk.
This guy is a tough nut to try to sort of explain.
Changed money with PayPal, was the first outside investor in Facebook, backed Palantir, which is, I believe they helped find Osama bin Laden.
Almost certainly the most successful technology investor in the world.
I don't think the future is fixed. I think what matters is a question of agency. What I think works really well are sort of one-of-a-kind companies. How do you get from 0 to 1? What great business is nobody building? Tell me something that's true that nobody agrees with you on.
All right, Peter, welcome back. It's good to see you. You don't do this too often, so we do appreciate it. But when you do it, you're always super candid, and we appreciate that as well. You fit right in here. You're sitting this year's political cycle out.
Right into
However,
politics.
Well, no, I mean, I think this is a question we all have, which is you were very active. You bet on JD in a major way. He delivered today. It was a very impressive discussion. Why aren't you involved this cycle? Where it's very confounding to us because these are your guys.
Man, how much time do we have? Let's talk about this for 2 hours or something. Yeah. I don't know. Look, I have a lot of conflicted thoughts on it. I am still very strongly pro-Trump, pro-JD. I've decided not to donate any money politically, but I'm supporting them in every other way possible. Obviously, I think there's my pessimistic thought is that Trump is going to win and probably will win by a big margin. He'll do better than the last time, and it'll still be really disappointing because the elections are always a relative choice, and then once someone's president, it's an absolute, and you get evaluated. Do you like Trump or Harris better? And there seem to be a lot of reasons, and that one would be more anti-Harris than anti-Trump. No one's pro any of these people. It's all negative, right?
Yeah.
But then after they win, there will be a lot of buyer's remorse and disappointment. And that's sort of the arc that I see of what's going to happen, and it's somewhat undermotivating. I don't know, just to describe it. I think the odds are slightly in favor of Trump, but it's basically 50-50. My one contrarian view on the election is that it's not going to be close. Most presidential elections aren't, and one side just breaks. 2016, 2020 were super close, but 2/3 of the elections aren't, and you can't always line things up and figure it out. I think either the Kamala bubble will burst, or maybe the Trump voters get really demotivated and don't show up. But I think one side is simply going to collapse in the next 2 months, and then if you want to get involved, with all the headaches that come with being involved, if it makes a difference counterfactually, and if it's a really close election, everything makes a difference. If it's not even close, I don't think it makes much of a difference. If it is going to be close, by the way, if it's like going to be a razor-thin close election, then I'm pretty sure Kamala will win because they will cheat, they will fortify it, they will steal the ballots, and so if we can, and so then in the event that it's close, I don't want to be involved. In the event that it's not close, I don't need to be involved. And so that's sort of a straightforward analysis right there.
Great jumping off point. How much cheating on a percentage basis do you think happens every year? How much, and do you think Trump actually won the last time?
You need to be careful with the verbs. So, cheating, stealing, that implies something happened the dark of night.
Massaging.
I think the verb you're allowed to use is fortify.
We don't want to get canceled on YouTube.
Ballot harvesting. I mean, it was, it's all sort of, there were all these rule changes. It was sort of done in plain daylight. And, but yeah, I think our elections they're not perfectly clean. Otherwise, we could examine it. We could have vigorous debate about it.
Well, what would you change then? What should change? Because we all want everybody's votes to count. We want it to be clean. I'm talking about the audience
here. I don't know. At a minimum, you'd try to run elections the same way you do it in every other Western democracy. You have one-day voting. You have practically no absentee ballots. You have, and it's one day where everything happens. It's not this two-month elongated process. That's the way you do it in every other country. You'd have some somewhat stronger voter ID, and make sure that the people who are voting have a right to vote.
Make it a national holiday.
But that's basically what you do in every other Western democracy, and it used to be much more like that in the U.S. I mean, it's meaningfully decayed over the last 20, 30 years. 20, 30 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, you got the results on the day of the vote, and that sort of stopped happening a while ago.
What would make you not disappointed? So Trump gets elected. What's your counter narrative on, we're a year, 2 years past the election, Trump is president. What makes you say I'm surprisingly not disappointed? What takes place?
Man, it's I think there are some extremely difficult problems that it's really hard to know how to solve them. I wouldn't know what to do, but we have an incredibly big deficit, and yeah, if you can find some way to meaningfully reduce the deficit with no tax hikes,
and without GDP contraction.
Well, you would do it if you got a lot of GDP growth, maybe.
Right.
But if you could meaningfully reduce the deficit with no tax hikes, that would be very impressive. I think we're sort of sleepwalking into Armageddon with the Ukraine and the conflict in Gaza are just sort of the warm-ups to the China-Taiwan war, and so if Trump can find a way to head that off, that would be incredible. If they don't go to war in 4 years, that will be better than I would expect, possibly.
In relation to Taiwan, if Trump called you and asked, should we defend it or not in this acute case, would you advise to let Taiwan be taken by China in order to avoid a nuclear holocaust and World War III? Or would you believe that we should defend it and defend free countries like that?
Well, I think you're probably not supposed to say.
Wait, but you're Peter Thiel.
I think there's so many ways our policies are messed up, but probably the one thing that's roughly correct on the Taiwan policy is that we don't tell China what we're going to do, and what we tell them is we don't know what we'll do, and we'll figure it out when you do it, which probably has the virtue of being correct. And then I think if you had a red line at Quemoy, Matsu, the island 5 miles off the coast of China, that's unbelievable. If you say we want some guardrails and we won't defend Taiwan, then they'd get invaded right away. So I think the policy of not saying what our policy is, and maybe not even having a policy, in some ways is relatively the best.
Yeah,
I think anything precise you say, that's going to just lead to war right away.
But what do you believe? Worth defending or not worth starting the conflict? Democracy in this tiny island worth going to war over or not? According to Peter Thiel,
it's not worth World War III, and I still think it's quite catastrophic if it gets taken over by the communists.
How does the world?
Those can both be true.
How does the world divide if we end up in heightened escalation? Is China, Russia, Iran friends? Is that an axis that forms? Think out the next decade in kind of your base case, and
I don't know what happens.
Estimate how the world divides.
I don't know what happens militarily if there's a China-Taiwan invasion. I mean, maybe we roll over. Maybe it escalates, all the way to nuclear war. Probably it's some very messy in between thing, sort of like what you have in the Ukraine. What I think happens economically is very straightforward. I think basically, you have with Russia and Germany, you had one Nord Stream pipeline, and we have the equivalent of 100 pipelines between the U.S. and China, and they all blow up. I met the TikTok CEO about a year ago, and maybe I wouldn't have said this now, but what I told him and what I felt was very honest advice was, you don't need to worry about the U.S. We're never going to do anything about TikTok. We're too incompetent. But if I were in your place, I would still get the business out of China. I would get the computers out, the people out. I'd completely decouple it from ByteDance because TikTok will be banned 24 hours after the Taiwan invasion. And if you think there's a 50-50 chance this happens, and that will destroy, 100% of the value of the TikTok franchise.
What was his reaction?
He said that they had done a lot of simulations, and there were a bunch of companies in World War I and World War II that managed to sell things to both sides.
He doesn't seem so bright to me. Do you think he's...
Honestly,
what was your take on him?
He didn't disagree with my frame, and so I always find that flattering if someone basically agrees with my framing. So he seemed perfectly bright to me, even though
game theory,
not
but
correct.
Game theory.
But
a lot of bright people.
But Peter, I saw you give
wrong about things,
I saw you give a talk last summer with Barry Weiss, and you talked about this decoupling should be happening. You weren't saying should. You were recommending that every industry leader consider decoupling from China. I think your comment was it's like picking up nickels in front of a freight train. Do you remember saying that?
I think there are a lot of different ways in which businesses are coupled to China. There were investors that tried investing. There are people who try to compete within China. There are people who built factories in China for export. There are different parts of that worked to varying degrees. But yeah, I certainly would not try to invest in a company that competed domestically inside China. I think that's virtually impossible. I think it's probably quite tricky even to invest in Chinese businesses. And then there is sort of this model of building factories in China for export to the West, and it was a very big arbitrage. These things do work, I visited the Foxconn factory 9 years ago, and it's you have people get paid $1.50, $2 an hour, and they work 12 hours a day, and they live in a dorm room with 2 bunk beds where you get 8 people in the dorm room. Someone's sleeping in your bed while you're working, and vice versa, and you sort of realize they're really far behind us or they're really far ahead of us, and either way, it's not that straightforward to just shift the iPhone factories to the United States. So I sort of understand, why a lot of businesses ended up there and why this is the arrangement that we have. But yeah, my intuition for what is going to happen, without making any normative judgments at all, is it is going to decouple.
How inflationary will that be?
It presumably is. It's presumably pretty inflationary. Yeah, that's probably the. I don't know. You'd have to sort of look at what the inelasticities of all these goods are.
So if that's true, what's the policy reaction?
It's probably not that. It may not be as inflationary as people think, because people always model trade in terms of pairwise, in terms of 2 countries. So if you literally have to move the people back to the U.S., that's insanely expensive. I don't know how much it would cost people to build an iPhone.
Does India become the new China?
Well, I think India is sort of too messed up. But you shift it to like Vietnam, Mexico. There are 5 billion people living in countries where the incomes are lower than China, and so probably the negative sum trade policy we should have with China is, we should just shift it to other countries, which is a little bit bad for the U.S., extremely bad for China, and let's say really good for Vietnam. That's kind of the negative sum policy that's going to manifest as this sort of decoupling happens.
Let's talk about avoiding it for a second here. Trump seems to be extremely good with dictators and authoritarians. Kim Jong-un seems like a big fan. I mean that as a compliment, as a superpower, right? Like, he doesn't have a problem talking to them. He connects with them, and they seem to like him. So what would be the path to him working with Xi to avoid this? Is there a path to avoid this? Because we were sitting here last year talking about this, and it just seems mind-boggling that if everybody agrees that this is going to happen, that we can't figure out a way to make it not happen.
Well, it's not just up to us. So there's, and so I don't know. It's obviously somewhat of a black box. We don't exactly I feel we just have no clue what people in China think. But I think it's sort of the sense of history is strongly the sort of Thucydides trap idea that you have a rising power against an existing power, and it tends to, it's Wilhelmine Germany versus Britain before World War I, and it's Athens against Sparta, the rising power against the existing power. You tend to get conflict. That's probably what deep down I think is really, really far in the China DNA. So I'd say maybe the first, I don't know, the meta version would be the first step to avoiding the conflict would be we have to start by admitting that China believes the conflict's happening.
Right.
And then if people like you are constantly saying, well, we just need to have some happy talk.
Right.
That is a recipe. That's a recipe for World War III.
I'm not advocating happy talk necessarily. I get accused of being a bit more hawkish.
Obviously, in general, I don't know. I'm not sure Trump should talk to the North Korean dictator, but yeah, in general, it's probably a good idea to try to talk to people, even if they're really bad people most of the time. And it's certainly a very odd dynamic with the U.S. and Russia at this point, where I think it is impossible for anybody in the Biden administration even to have a back channel communication with people. Like I don't think Tucker Carlson counts as an emissary from the Biden administration. And if anybody gets tuckered, or I don't know what the verb is, who talks, that seems worse than the alternative.
Can we talk about technology? You have this. You have a speech where you talk about some of the misguided things we've done in the past in the name of technology, and use like big data as an example of that. What is AI?
Oh man, that's sort of a big question. I always had this riff where I don't like the buzzwords, and machine learning, big data, cloud computing. I'm going to build a mobile app, bring the cloud to. If you have sort of a concatenation of buzzwords, my first instinct is just to run away as fast as possible. It's some really bad groupthink, and for many years, my bias is probably that AI was one of the worst of all these buzzwords. It meant, the next generation of computers, the last generation of computers, anything in between. So it's meant all these very different things. If we roll the clock back to the 2010s, probably the AI, to the extent you concretize it, I would say the AI debate was maybe framed by the two canonical books that framed it. There was the Bostrom book, Superintelligence 2014, where AI was going to be this superhuman, super duper intelligent thing. And then the anti-Bostrom book was the Kai-Fu Lee 2018 AI Superpowers. You can think of the CCP rebuttal to Bostrom, where basically AI was going to be surveillance tech, face recognition, and China was going to win because they had no qualms about applying this technology. And then if we now think about what actually happened, let's say with the LLMs and chat GPT, it was really neither of those two. And it was this in-between thing, which was actually what people would have defined AI as for the previous 60 or 70 years, which is passing the Turing test, which is the somewhat fuzzy line. It's a computer that can pretend to be a human, or that can fool you into thinking it's a human. And even with the fuzziness of that line, you could say that pre-ChatGPT it wasn't passed, and then ChatGPT passed it. And that seems very, very significant. And then obviously it leads to all these questions. What does it mean? Is it going to complement people? Is it going to substitute for people? What does it do to the labor market? Do you get paid more?
If you take
do you get paid less? So there are all these questions, but it seems extremely important, and it's probably certainly the big picture questions, which I think Silicon Valley is always very bad at talking about, is like what does it mean to be a human being?
Right.
Sort of the stupid 2022 answer would be that humans differ from all the other animals because we're good at languages. If you're a 3-year-old or an 80-year-old, you speak, you communicate, we tell each other stories. This is what makes us different. And so yeah, I think there's something about it that's incredibly important and very disorienting. The question I always have the narrower question I have as an investor is sort of how do you make money with this stuff? And
how do you make money?
it's pretty confusing, and I think I don't know. This is always where I'm anchored on the late '90s as sort of the formative period for me. But I keep thinking that AI in 2023, 2024 is like the internet in 1999. It's really big. It's going to be very important. It's going to transform the world, not in 6 months, but in 20 years. And then there are probably all kinds of incredibly catastrophic approximations where, what businesses are going to make money, who's going to have the monopoly, who's going to have pricing power, is super unclear. Probably, one layer deeper of analysis, if attention is all you need, and if you're not post-economic, you need to pay attention to who's making money. And in AI, it's basically one company is making, NVIDIA is making over 100% of the profits. Everybody else is collectively losing money. And so there's sort of you have to do some sort, you should try to do some sort of analysis. Do you go long NVIDIA? Do you go short? Is it, my monopoly question, is it a really durable monopoly? And then it's hard for me to know because I'm in Silicon Valley and we haven't done anything in semiconductors for a long time. So I have no clue.
Do you, let's de-buzzword the word AI and say it's a bunch of process automation. Let's just say that's version 0.1, where brains that are roughly the equivalent of a teenager can do a lot of manual stuff. Have you thought about what it means for 8 billion people in the world if there's an extra billion that necessarily couldn't work, or like whether that in political or economic terms?
I don't know. I don't know if this is the same, but this is the history of 250 years. The Industrial Revolution, what was that it adds to GDP. It frees people up to do more productive things. Maybe there was a Luddite critique in the 19th century of the factories that people were going to be unemployed and wouldn't have anything to do because the machines would replace the people. Maybe the Luddites are right this time around. I'm probably pretty skeptical of it, but yeah, it's extremely confusing. Where the gains and losses are. There probably are. There's always sort of a hobby. You can always just use it on your hobby horses. So I don't know, my anti-Hollywood or anti-university hobby horse is that it seems to me that the AI is quite good at the woke stuff, and so if you want to be a successful actor, you should be maybe a little bit racist or a little bit sexist or just really funny. And you won't have any risk of the AI replacing you. Everybody else will get replaced, and then probably, I don't know, Claudine Gay, the plagiarizing Harvard University president. The AI is going to, the AI will produce endless amounts of these sort of, I don't even know what to call them, woke papers, and. They were all already sort of plagiarizing one another because they were always saying the same thing over and over again.
They were using their own version of
the AI is just going to flood the zone with even more of that. And that, I don't know. Obviously, they've been able to do it for a long time and no one's noticed. But I think at this point, it doesn't seem promising from a competitive point of view. But
what are the areas?
Those are obviously my hobby horses. So I'm just that's maybe just wishful thinking on my part.
What are the areas of technology that you're curious about, that your mind is like, wow, this is really, I have to learn more, pay attention?
I always think you want to instantiate it more in companies than things, or if you ask sort of like where is innovation happening? In our society, and it doesn't have to be this way, but it's mostly in a certain subset of relatively small companies where you have these relatively small teams of people that are really pushing the envelope, and that's sort of what I find inspiring about venture capital. And then obviously you don't just want innovation, you also want it to translate into good businesses. But that's where it happens. It doesn't happen in universities. It doesn't happen in government. There was a time it did. I mean, somehow in this very, very weird, different country that was the United States in the 1940s, you had, somehow the army organized the scientists and got them to produce a nuclear bomb in Los Alamos in 3.5 years. And the way the New York Times editorialized after that was, it was sort of an anti-libertarian write-up. It was, there were, obviously, maybe if you'd left the prima donna scientists to their own, it would have taken them 50 years to build a bomb, and the army could just tell them what to do, and this should silence anybody who doesn't believe the government can do things. And they don't write editorials like that in the New York Times anymore. But I think, that's sort of where one should look. I think a crazy amount of it still happens in the United States. And there's sort of, we've episodically tried to do all this investing. We've probably tried to do too much investing in Europe over the years. It's always sort of a junket. It's a nice place to go on vacation as an investor. And it is very. I don't have a great explanation, but it's a very strange thing that so much of it is still. The U.S. is somehow still the country where people do new things.
Peter, is that a team, organizational, social, evolutionary problem in the United States? What is the root cause of the failure to innovate in the United States relative to the expectation going back 70 years, 50 years, et cetera? From the rocket ships, and we're all going to live.
Yeah, well, this is always one of the big picture claims I have, that we've been in an era of relative tech stagnation the last 40 or 50 years, or the tagline that we had in our
and techno-negativism.
They promised us flying cars. All we got was 140 characters, which is not an anti-Twitter, anti-X commentary. Even though the way I used to always qualify it was that at least it was at least a good company. You had 10,000 people who didn't have to do very much work and could just smoke marijuana all day.
Very similar to Europe.
And so I think that part actually did get corrected, but
very subtle.
But I think.
Like, what went wrong? Because you point out that it's not a technology trend tracker that you think about. It's about people and teams that innovate and drive to outcomes based on their view of the world. And what's gone wrong with our view of the world and our ability to organize to achieve the seemingly unachievable, with very rare exceptions. Obviously, Elon's here later, but yeah.
It's overdetermined. The rough frame I always have, and again, it's not that there's been no innovation. There's been a decent amount of innovation in the world of bits, computers, internet, mobile internet, crypto, AI. So there are sort of all these world of bits places where there was a significant but sort of somehow narrow cone of progress. But it was everything having to do with atoms that was slow. And this was already the case when I was an undergraduate at Stanford in the late 80s. In retrospect, any applied engineering field was a bad idea. It was a bad idea to become a chemical engineer, a mechanical engineer. Aeroastro was terrible. Nuclear engineering, everyone knew. I mean, I think no one did that, And there's something about the world of atoms that from a libertarian point of view, you'd say it got regulated to death. There probably there's some set of arguments where the low-hanging fruit got picked and got harder to find new things to do. Although I always think that was just a sort of baby boomer excuse for covering up for the failures of that generation. And then I think maybe a very big picture part of it was that at some point in the 20th century, the idea took hold that not all forms of technological progress were simply good and simply for the better. And there's something about the two world wars and the development of nuclear weapons that gradually pushed people into this more risk-averse society. And it didn't happen overnight, but maybe a quarter century after the nuclear bomb, it's
by Woodstock it happened.
By Woodstock it happened.
Yeah, because that was the same summer we landed on the moon.
Woodstock was 3 weeks after that.
Yeah, that was the tipping point.
Progress stopped and the hippies took over.
Okay, sex. Yeah.
Can we shift gears just to the domestic economy? What do you think is happening in the domestic economy? And just as backdrop, we've had something like 14 straight months of downward revisions to jobs. The revisions are supposed to be completely random, but somehow they've all been down. Probably doesn't mean anything. There's also what's happening with the yield curve, but I'll stop there. What's your take on what's happening in the economy?
You know, it's always hard to know exactly. Yeah, I suspect we're close to a recession. I've probably thought this for a while. It's being stopped by really big government spending. So, in May of 2023, the projection for the deficit in fiscal year 24, which is October of 23 to September of 24, was something like 1.5, 1.6 trillion. The deficit's going to come in about 400 billion higher. And so, which, it was a sort of a crazy deficit was projected, and it was way off. And then somehow, and so if we had not found another 400 billion to add to, this crazy deficit at the top of the economic cycle, you're supposed to increase deficits in a recession, not at the top of the cycle. Things would be probably very shaky. So there's some way where we have too much debt, not enough sustainable growth. Again, I always think it comes back to tech innovation. There probably are other ways to grow an economy without tech or intensive progress. But I think we don't have those don't seem to be on offer, and then that's where it's very deeply stuck. If you wind back over the last 50 years, there's always a question: why did people not realize that this tech stagnation had happened sooner? And I think there were two one-time things people could do economically that had nothing to do with science or tech. There was a 1980s Reagan-Thatcher move, which was to massively cut taxes, deregulate, allow lots of companies to merge and combine, and it was sort of a one-time way to make the economy a lot bigger, even though it was not something that really had the sort of compounding effect. So it led to one great decade. And then there was, and that was sort of the right-wing capitalist move. And then in the 90s, there was sort of a Clinton-Blair center-left thing, which was sort of leaning into globalization. And there was a giant global arbitrage you could do, which also had a lot of negative externalities that came with it. But it sort of was a one-time move. And I think both of those are not on offer. I don't necessarily think you should undo globalization. I don't think you should raise taxes like crazy. But you can't do more globalization or more tax cuts here. That's not going to be the win. And so I think you have to somehow get back to the future.
We have time for a couple more questions. You, I think, saw that maybe those Ivy League institutions maybe weren't producing the best and brightest, or weren't exactly hitting their mandate, and you created the Thiel Fellows. And you've been doing that for a while, and I meet them all because they all have crazy ideas and they pitch me for angel investment. What have you learned getting people to quit school, giving them $100,000, and then how many parents call you and get really upset that their kids are quitting school?
Well, I don't know. I've learned a lot. I mean, I don't know. I think the universities are far worse than I even thought when I started this thing. I think, it's I did this debate at Yale last week. Resolved higher education's a bubble, and you sort of go through all the different numbers, and then and again I was careful to word it in such a way that I didn't have to. And then people kept saying, well, what's your alternative? What should people do instead? And I said, nope, was not the debate. I'm not your guidance counselor. I'm not your career counselor. I don't know how to solve your problems. But if something's a bubble, the first thing you should do is probably not, lean into it in too crazy a way. And, the student debt was $300 billion in 2000. It's basically close to $2 trillion at this point. So it's just been this sort of runaway process. And then if you look at it by cohort, if you graduated from college in 1997, 12 years later, people still had student debt, but most of the people had sort of paid it down. But by 2009, we started the Thiel Fellowship in 2010, and it felt, by 2009, was the first cohort where this really stopped. If you take the people who graduated from college in 2009 and you fast forward 12 years to 2021, the median person had more student debt 12 years later than they graduated with, because it's actually just compounding faster. And it was partially the global financial crisis. The people had less well-paying jobs, they stayed in college longer, and the colleges. It's just sort of been this background thing where it's decayed in these really significant ways. And again, I think it's on some level there are sort of a lot of debates in our society that are probably dominated by sort of a boomer narrative, and maybe the baby boomers were the last generation where college really worked, and they think, well, I worked my way through college, and why can't an 18-year-old going to college do that today? And so I think the bubble will be done once the boomers have exited stage left.
But does the government need to stop?
It'd be good if we figured something out before then.
Does the government need to stop underwriting the loans? Because it's the lending. I think the 90+% of the capital in the student loan programs is funded by the federal government. And if you're an accredited university, you can take out a loan and go to it. And accreditation in a rigid kind of free market system, you would have an underwriter that says, are you going to be able to graduate, make enough money to pay your loan off? Is this a good school? Are you going to get a good job? And then the market would figure out whether or not to give you a loan, would figure out what the rate should be, and so on. But in this case, the government simply provides capital to support all of this. And as a result, everything's gotten more expensive. And the rigidity in the system that basically qualifies schools and the quality of those schools relative to the earning potential over time is gone. Sure. So we need the government to get out of the student loan business.
Yeah, but look, the place where I know I'm sort of, some ways I'm right wing, some ways I'm left wing on this. So the place where I'm left wing is, I do think a lot of the students got ripped off, and so I think there should be some kind of broad
relief,
student debt forgiveness at this point.
Who should pick up the tab?
But it's not just the taxpayers; it's the universities, and it's the bondholders.
Got it.
The bondholders
take a little bit out of those endowments.
And the universities, and then obviously, if you just make it the taxpayers, then the universities can just charge more and more every year. There's no incentive to reform whatsoever. But
you've had
it's in 2005. It was under Bush 43 that the bankruptcy laws got rewritten in the U.S., where you cannot discharge student debt even if you go bankrupt, and if you haven't paid it off by the time you're 65, your Social Security wage checks will be garnished.
It's crazy.
So I do think.
But should we stop lending? Should the federal government get out of the student lending business?
Well, if we say that if we start with my place where a lot of the student debt should be forgiven, and then
reform the whole program.
We'll see how many people are willing to lend. How many of the colleges can pay for all the students.
What's your sense if it was a totally free market system? How many colleges would shut down because they wouldn't be able to? There's no tuition support.
It probably would be a lot smaller. You might not have to shut them down because there's a lot of them have gotten extremely bloated. It's like Baumal's cost disease, where I don't know I have no idea. Like a place like UCLA, it probably has twice or three times as many bureaucrats as they had 30, 40 years ago. So there's sort of all these sort of parasitic people that have sort of gradually accrued, and so there's probably there would be a lot of rational ways to dial this back, but yeah, maybe
we're going to need a new location for next year.
If the only way to lose weight is to cut off your thumb, that's kind of a difficult way to go on a diet.
Peter, three of your collaborators, longtime collaborators, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and Sam Altman, are arguably the three leading AI language model leaders. Which one is going to win? Rank them in order and tell us a little bit about each. Peter said he would answer any question.
I said I would take any question. I didn't say to answer any question.
You said you would honestly. You said today you felt extremely honest and candid. So let's.
Yeah, but I've already been extremely honest and candid. So I think I can stop here.
Quota math.
It's whoever I talk to last.
Okay. Well, okay. Why don't you?
They're all very, very convincing people. So
Great answer.
I don't know.
Well, maybe talk a little bit about each individual.
I talked to Elon a while ago, and it was just how ridiculous it was that Sam Altman was getting away with turning OpenAI from a nonprofit into a for-profit. That was such a scam. If everybody was allowed to do this, everybody would do this. That it has to be totally illegal what Sam's doing, and it shouldn't be allowed at all. And that seemed really, really convincing in the moment. And then sort of half an hour later, I thought to myself, but actually, it's been such a horrifically mismanaged place at OpenAI with this preposterous nonprofit board they had. Nobody would do this again. And so there actually isn't much of a moral hazard from it. So, but yeah, whoever I talk to, I find very convincing in the moment.
Will that space just get commoditized? I mean, do you see a path to a monopoly there?
Well, again, this is again where you should, attention is all you need. You need to pay attention to who's making money. It's NVIDIA. It's the hardware, the chips layer, and then it's just what we, it's not what we've done in tech for 30 years.
Are they making 120% of the profits?
I think everybody else is losing money collectively. Yeah, everyone else is just spending money on the computer. So it's one company that's making. I mean, maybe there's a few other people that are making some money. I mean, I assume TSMC and ASML, but yeah, I think everyone else is collectively losing money.
What do you think of Zuckerberg's approach to say, I'm so far behind, this isn't core to my business, I'm going to open source it? Is that going to be the winning strategy? Handicap that for us.
Again, I would say my big qualification is, my model is AI it does feel uncomfortably close to the bubble of 1999. So we haven't invested that much in it, and I want to have more clarity in investing. But the simplistic question is, who's going to make money? I think a year ago, 2 years ago, in retrospect, NVIDIA would have been a good buy. I think at this point, everybody, it's sort of too obvious that they're making too much money. Everyone's going to try to copy them on the chip side. Maybe that's straightforward to do. Maybe it's not. But that's, I'd say probably you should if you want to figure out the AI thing, you should not be asking this question about Meta or OpenAI or any of these things. You should really be focusing on the NVIDIA question, the chips question, and the fact that we're not able to focus on that. That tells us something about how we've all been trained. I think NVIDIA got started in 1993.
Yeah.
I believe that was the last year where anybody in their right mind would have studied electrical engineering over computer science. Right? 94, Netscape takes off, and then it's probably a really bad idea to start a semiconductor company even in 93. But the benefit is there was going to be no one would come after you. No talented people started semiconductor companies after 1993 because they all went into software.
Score their monopoly power.
I think it's quite strong because of this history that I just gave you, where none of us know anything about chips. And then I think the risk, it's always, if attention is all that you need, the qualifier to that is, when you get started as an actress, as a startup, as a company, you need attention. Then it's desirable to get more, and at some point, attention becomes the worst thing in the world. And there was the one day where NVIDIA had the largest market cap in the world earlier this year. And I do think that represented a phase transition. Once that happened, they probably had more attention than was good.
Hey, Peter, as we wrap here, your brain works in a unique way. You're an incredible strategist. You think, very differently than a lot of the folks that we get to talk to. With all of this, are you optimistic for the future?
I always push back on that question. I think extreme optimism and extreme pessimism are both really bad attitudes, and they're somehow the same thing. extreme pessimism, nothing you can do, extreme optimism, the future will take care of itself. So if you have to have one, it's probably, you want to be somewhere in between, maybe mildly optimistic, mildly pessimistic. But I believe in human agency, and that it's up to us, and it's not some sort of winning a lottery ticket or some astrological chart that's going to decide things. And I believe in human agency, and that's sort of an axis that's very different from optimism or pessimism.
What a great
extreme
place.
Optimism, extreme pessimism, they're both excuses for laziness.
What an amazing place to end. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Peter Thiel.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks
Come
a lot.
on now.
Thanks, man.
Wow.
All right.
Peter Thiel.